There is a car manufacturer that should not exist. It was not supposed to happen. The man who built it never planned to build cars. The engineers who gave it life had already been fired by someone else. The factory that produced it was purchased out of spite. And the machine that finally proved it all was designed in secret, at night, without the boss knowing. That company is Lamborghini, and the story behind how it came to exist and nearly disappeared 3 separate times before it found its place in the world begins not in a sports car factory, but in a field with a broken clutch and a very insulting conversation. If you're watching this on TV and you enjoy what we do here, uncovering the hidden history behind the machines you've always known, consider subscribing if you can. It's one of the simplest ways to help this channel grow. And if this story surprises you, share it. That's how more people find us. To understand why Lamborghini had to exist, you first need to understand what northern Italy looked like in the years immediately after World War II. The Emilia-Romagna region. The flat, agricultural corridor running between Bologna and Modena in the Po Valley had survived the war, but just barely. The fighting had passed through it. The infrastructure was damaged, the farms needed machinery, and there was almost none left. What soldiers had left behind were the mechanical scraps of conflict. Old truck engines, military vehicle differentials, surplus metal components that had served armies and were now rusting in government depots called ARR centers, where post-war Italy stored and sold its inherited junk. It was in this world that a young man named Ferruccio Lamborghini saw an opportunity. Born to grape farmers in Renazzo, within the municipality of Cento in the Emilia-Romagna region, his mechanical know-how led him to enter the business of tractor manufacturing in 1948. He was not wealthy. He was not connected. What he had was an engineering mind, a talent for improvisation, and a specific understanding of what Italian farmers needed that almost nobody was paying attention to yet. Lamborghini Trattori did not have a long tradition like the historical names Fiat Trattori and Landini. In fact, it had to use discarded war materials to produce its first tractors. Truck and military vehicle engines and differentials sourced from ARAR centers were used to build the first tractors. What he built from those scraps was a business. And within a few years, that business became one of the most important tractor manufacturers in Italy. The timing was not accidental. Italy, after the war, needed to feed itself. The government understood this. The Fanfani Law of July 25, 1952 set aside 125 billion lire, at an interest rate of 3%, over 5 years for farmers who purchased Italian-made agricultural machinery. That legislation was, in practical terms, a government subsidy for exactly the product Ferruccio Lamborghini was selling. The farms bought tractors. Lamborghini made tractors. The money flowed. By the late 1950s, he had expanded. He moved into oil burners, then into heating and air conditioning equipment. He became, in the vocabulary of post-war Italian industry, a successful industrialist, the kind of man who had made himself without inheriting anything. The kind of man who drove expensive cars to business meetings because the cars announced his arrival before he said a word. When new tractor company clients came in to sign contracts, Ferruccio would always take them to dinner in his Ferrari. He owned several of them. A white Ferrari for himself, a black one for his wife, a Maserati, a Jaguar, a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. These were not toys for a man who had grown up around farming equipment. They were the objects through which a self-made man from the Po Valley communicated that he had arrived. But there was a problem with one of the Ferraris. The clutch kept failing. A clutch, in the mechanical sense, is not a complex component. It connects the engine to the gearbox. It allows a driver to shift gears without destroying the transmission. It wears out over time, particularly if driven hard. This is normal. This is expected. In a tractor, a worn clutch is an inconvenience. In a Ferrari, apparently, it was a recurring catastrophe. While he liked to put on a show, the truth is that Ferruccio Lamborghini was not a particularly good driver. He was always burning the clutch. The Ferrari factory in Maranello, a small town near Modena, essentially a neighbor of Lamborghini's own world, handled warranty repairs, and Ferruccio kept going back. After the third or fourth visit, he had his own tractor mechanics take the Ferrari apart to look at what was actually failing. What they found changed everything. As it turns out, Ferrari was using the same clutch component he used in his tractors. Lamborghini was outraged. He paid 10 lire for his tractor clutches, yet Ferrari charged him 1,000 lire for the same part. This was not simply a matter of price. This was a matter of principle. Here was the most celebrated sports car manufacturer in Italy, perhaps the most prestigious in the world, charging its customers extraordinary sums of money for a component that came from agricultural machinery. Ferruccio Lamborghini, who built the tractors, who knew exactly what those clutches cost, found himself paying 100 times their actual value. In a Ferrari, that he was being told was the finest driving machine money could buy. He drove to Maranello. He asked to speak to Enzo Ferrari directly. And according to the account Lamborghini gave in a 1991 interview with Thoroughbred and Classic Cars magazine, after waiting a very long time, he finally got his meeting. "I decided to talk to Enzo Ferrari," Lamborghini said. "I had to wait for him a very long time. Ferrari, your cars are rubbish," I complained. Il Commendatore was furious. "Lamborghini, you may be able to drive a tractor, but you will never be able to handle a Ferrari properly." It is worth pausing here to acknowledge what the historical record actually shows. The exchange between Enzo Ferrari and Ferruccio Lamborghini is often cited as a primary factor that motivated Lamborghini to become an auto manufacturer. But the story is as much the stuff of legend as it is of fact. Different versions exist. Some accounts focus on the clutch. Others suggest a broader complaint about Ferrari's customer service. What appears consistent across all the versions is the essential shape of the encounter. A successful man went to complain and was dismissed as someone who should not be involved in the world of real automobiles. Whatever the precise words were, Ferruccio Lamborghini drove home. And somewhere on that road between Maranello and his world, he made a decision. If Ferrari would not fix the car, he would build a better one himself. The decision sounds impulsive. It was not entirely. Ferruccio Lamborghini had spent years watching the Italian sports car market from the outside. He had owned enough expensive machines to understand their weaknesses. He knew what they cost to build and what they were sold for. A clever businessman, Lamborghini also knew that he could make triple the profit if the components used in his tractors were installed in a high-performance exotic car instead. But to build a car, he needed engineers. And he needed engineers who were very good, available quickly, and, ideally, motivated by something beyond a paycheck. As it happened, a remarkable group of people had recently become available. 2 years earlier, in November 1961, something extraordinary had occurred inside the Ferrari factory in Maranello. It was later called the Palace Revolt, and it began not because of anything mechanical, but because of Enzo Ferrari's wife. Laura Ferrari had grown increasingly involved in the day-to-day operations of the company following the death of her son Dino in 1956. As the 1960s got underway, Laura Ferrari was perhaps seeking a purpose. With her only son dead and the discovery that her husband had a second family, it's likely that she needed a change. Laura Ferrari began to play a greater role in the day-to-day operations of the Scuderia. Sales manager Girolamo Gardini was Laura's most frequently targeted victim and had to endure many verbal conflicts. Gardini got fed up and turned to Enzo with an ultimatum. Either Laura backs off, or Gardini would leave the company. Enzo Ferrari fired Gardini. What happened next caught him completely unprepared. Four of Ferrari's senior staff, including chief engineer Carlo Citti and development engineer Bizzarini, staged a walkout in order to get Gardini reinstated, and Ferrari responded by firing them all. The men who walked out were not minor figures. Carlo Citti had just finished designing Ferrari's World Championship-winning Formula One car, the famous Shark Nose that won Phil Hill the 1961 driver's title. Giotto Bizzarini was the engineer who had masterminded the Ferrari 250 GTO, one of the most capable racing cars Ferrari had ever produced, and who had also developed some of the company's most celebrated V12 engines. Team manager Romolo Tavoni was gone. Several others followed. In a single act of defiance and in a single act of dismissal, Ferrari had lost the core of its technical brain. The timing of the walkout was bad. Losing the championship-winning engineer was a huge blow. Meanwhile, strong competition from Jaguar and the Shelby Cobra in the GT League meant that Bizzarini had just started working on what might be Ferrari's most beautiful car, the 250 GTO. This car was halfway through development when he left. The departed engineers formed their own venture, a company called ATS, Automobili Turismo e Sport, in Bologna. They had ambitions and talent. What they lacked was money and the kind of industrial infrastructure required to turn engineering drawings into finished automobiles. ATS built cars, raced them briefly, and collapsed by 1964. When Giotto Bizzarini emerged from that collapse, Ferruccio Lamborghini was already looking for him. The arrangement was unusual even by the informal standards of the Italian automotive industry in the 1960s. Bizzarini was a freelance engineer. He was brilliant, he was available, and he came with a very specific history. He had helped design some of the finest engines Ferrari had ever produced, and he had been ejected from Maranello in circumstances that left him with something to prove. Ferruccio understood this perfectly. To design the engine, Ferruccio Lamborghini chose an exceptional external consultant. The engineer Giotto Bizzarini, born in Quercianella in 1926, still today considered one of the best engine designers who ever lived. Bizzarini was a huge fan of racing and dreamed of building an engine for Formula One. The contract, as the story has been told, included a payment structure that rewarded Bizzarini for every additional unit of power he extracted above a baseline. Essentially, the more powerful the engine, the more he earned. Whether this incentivized him to build something wilder than Ferruccio actually wanted is a question the historical record leaves partly open. What is not in question is the result. Bizzarini designed a V12 engine. It had 4 overhead camshafts. It was built entirely from aluminum alloy. It used downdraft Weber carburetors and a dry sump lubrication system. In the version Bizzarini built for testing, the engine produced somewhere close to 360 horsepower and spun to extraordinary revs. It was a racing engine. It was barely a road car engine at all. The unit Bizzarini created could deliver 360 HP at 8,000 RPM, thanks to race-inspired vertical 36-meter Weber carburetors, a dry sump oil system, and a high compression ratio of 11:1. Ferruccio Lamborghini, to his credit, understood the problem immediately. He was not building a racing car. He wanted something that would humiliate Ferrari on Ferrari's own terms. As a grand touring machine, as a daily driver for wealthy men who wanted to travel fast in comfort without the engine destroying itself every 200 miles. A racing engine screaming at 8,000 revolutions per minute was not going to achieve that. He hired 2 additional engineers, both of them young. Both of them recently recruited into what was becoming a genuinely serious project. Giampaolo Dallara would handle chassis engineering. Paolo Stanzani would work on adapting the Bizzarini engine into something that would survive the road. Ferruccio Lamborghini was not interested in racing. He wanted a smooth-running engine with long service intervals and greater reliability than anything else on offer. With this in mind, Dallara set about toning things down a little. The camshaft profiles were softened. The downdraft carburetors were replaced with side draft units that solved clearance problems. The dry sump lubrication was dropped for a conventional wet sump system. The compression ratio came down from 11:1 to a more manageable 9.5:1. What emerged produced 280 horsepower at 6,500 revolutions per minute. Still extraordinary for a road car in 1963, but something a driver could actually manage without specialist knowledge. In parallel, Ferruccio had already committed to a factory, He started working on this project in late 1962, and by May 1963 had already founded Automobili Ferruccio Lamborghini, buying a large plot of land in Sant'Agata Bolognese, about 25 kilometers from Bologna, to build a new large and ultra-modern factory. The factory was built between fields. Sant'Agata Bolognese was not a village anyone outside the region would have recognized. It sat on flat agricultural land, surrounded by the same kind of scenery that Ferruccio had grown up in. The irony was entirely intentional. The tractor maker was building his sports car factory in a farm town, just down the road from the city where his competition, Ferrari, had been dismissing him as someone who belonged in a field. The prototype, called the 350 GTV, was unveiled at the Turin Motor Show in October 1963. It was a static display. The 350 GTV was shown at the Turin Auto Show with the original Bizzarini Racing V12 engine displayed alongside, as it was not adapted to the chassis. The car was a static display with the suspension arms simply tack welded in place and the engine not installed. The reaction was lukewarm. The car looked the part, angular, low, with a body designed by Franco Scaglione, but the automotive press could see that it was unfinished. Orders were not placed in the way Ferruccio had hoped. The setback could have ended the project. It did not. Within 5 months, a time frame that still seems almost implausible, the engineering team had completely reworked the car. Carrozzeria Touring, a respected Milanese coach builder, redesigned the body into something more cohesive. Dallara reworked the chassis. Stanzani finished the engine adaptation. And in March 1964, at the Geneva Motor Show, Lamborghini unveiled the 350 GT. The 350 GT debuted at the March 1964 Geneva Motor Show, and production began the following May. The success of this model ensured the company's survival, establishing it as a viable competitor with rival manufacturer Ferrari. The first customer to receive the new 350 GT was drummer Giampiero Giusti, who was at the height of his success with his jazz band. The move got the attention of celebrities. A string of actors and musicians were suddenly interested in what Lamborghini rolled out in Sant'Agata Bolognese. Ferrari had called Ferruccio a tractor maker. In less than a year, actors were driving his cars, but Ferruccio Lamborghini himself was already thinking about something much more radical. The 350 GT was successful. It proved the company could build a competitive grand touring machine. It proved the engineers were capable. It proved that a factory in a farm town near Bologna could turn out automobiles that sophisticated buyers were willing to pay serious money for. It was not, however, a Ferrari killer. Not yet. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who was working at Lamborghini in 1964 and what those people were thinking when nobody senior was listening. Giampaolo Dallara was 26 years old. Paolo Stanzani was around the same age. Their test driver was a New Zealander named Bob Wallace, a quietly methodical man who happened to be extraordinarily good at understanding what a car could and could not do at its limits. Between them, these three had spent enough time with racing machinery to share an opinion that the sports car world had not yet fully confronted. The future of high-performance road cars was not in the front. The engine should be in the middle. During 1965, Lamborghini's three top engineers, Giampaolo Dallara, Paolo Stanzani, and Bob Wallace, put their own time into developing a prototype car known as the P400. The engineers envisioned a road car with racing pedigree, one which could win on the track and be driven on the road by enthusiasts. The three men worked on its design at night, hoping to convince company founder Ferruccio Lamborghini such a vehicle would neither be too expensive nor distract from the company's focus. This detail is important. They were working at night, without authorization, in secret. Ferruccio Lamborghini had a strict policy against racing. He had written it into the company's founding documents. He had watched Ferrari pour money into motorsport and seen how that pressure had twisted Ferrari's priorities, how it had contributed to the internal tensions that drove some of the best engineers in Maranello to walk out. He wanted no part of it. He wanted grand touring cars for wealthy gentlemen, not racing machines for paying customers. His engineers apparently had other ideas. What Dallara and Stanzani were sketching, in their own time, on their own initiative, was a chassis that placed the engine not in front of the driver, but directly behind the seat, mounted across the width of the car rather than along its length. A transverse mid-engine layout. The same configuration already used in Formula One and sports car racing, where it allowed a small, lightweight car to carry enormous power while keeping weight centered and low. No production road car had ever been built this way at scale. The question was whether Ferruccio would agree to it. The rolling chassis was displayed at the Turin Salon in 1965. Impressed showgoers placed orders for the car despite the lack of a body to go over the chassis. That last sentence deserves to be considered carefully. People were ordering a car that had no body. They were responding to an unpainted steel chassis on a show stand, to a mechanical layout they could read by looking at the engine position and understanding what it meant. This was not normal automotive consumer behavior. Something about what Dallara and Stanzani had built communicated possibility in a way that transcended the finished product. Bertone, the legendary Italian coach builder, was at the show. According to legend, Nuccio Bertone examined the chassis on display and told Ferruccio Lamborghini that his studio would design the perfect shoe for this wonderful foot. Whether this dialogue actually took place like this cannot be proven today. What is undisputed is that this anecdote reflects the immediate mutual understanding and creative agreement between the two entrepreneurs. The man Bertone assigned to design the body was 25 years old. His name was Marcello Gondini. What Gondini drew, rapidly, in the weeks between Turin and the next Geneva Motor Show, was a car so low and so wide, and so visually aggressive that it seemed to have come from a different decade than the world around it. Flowing fenders, retractable headlights, pronounced air intakes behind the side windows to feed the engine breathing immediately behind the passenger compartment. A silhouette that looked less like a production car than like a racing prototype that had been given permission to drive on public roads. It was called the Miura, named after a Spanish fighting bull. When Lamborghini debuted the Miura at the Geneva Motor Show on March 10, 1966, the company did far more than introduce a new car. It redefined what a high-performance road vehicle could be. There is one detail about that debut that the company itself has acknowledged, with something between embarrassment and pride. None of the engineers had found time to check if the engine fitted inside its compartment. Committed to showing the car, they decided to fill the engine bay with ballast and keep the hood locked throughout the show. The world's first true supercar debuted at a major international motor show with a locked hood, hiding the fact that the engine had not yet been confirmed to actually fit. The Miura worked anyway. Between 1966 and 1973, Lamborghini built 763 Miuras. The Miura quickly became a cult object among business leaders, artists, and international celebrities. Its broader pop culture breakthrough also came through film, with the opening sequence of The Italian Job helping cement its legend. The film opens with a yellow Miura driving through the Mont Blanc tunnel in the Alps, engine reverberating off the concrete walls. The most beautiful car in the world at that moment, in a sequence that has nothing to do with the plot and everything to do with establishing what the late 1960s considered speed. Ferrari had told Ferruccio Lamborghini to stick to tractors. 3 years later, his car was the opening image of one of the most celebrated films in British cinema. The Miura did something that Ferruccio had not entirely intended, and that the automotive world had not yet fully processed. It created a category. Before the Miura, there were sports cars. There were Grand Tourers. There were racing machines. There were fast road cars. The vocabulary existed, and the machines existed to fill it. In 1966, Lamborghini shook the automotive establishment when it mounted its powerful V12 engine transversely in a rear mid position on the P400 Miura, the vehicle for which the term supercar was coined. That word, supercar, had not been used in this way before. It emerged from the Miura coverage precisely because there was no existing category into which the machine fit. It was faster than any road car that had come before it. It was more dramatic in design than any production automobile available. It was not a race car, because it had an interior and it could be driven to dinner. It was not a grand tourer, because its priorities were not comfort and refinement. It was something new, and it had come from a tractor manufacturer who had been insulted by the person he admired most. For Ferrari, the competitive pressure was real. The Miura forced a reckoning. The traditional front-engine layout that Ferrari had championed, the layout that placed the power source at the front of the car and sent it through a long drive shaft to the rear wheels, was suddenly visible as a compromise. Not wrong, but not the only answer anymore, and not the most advanced answer. Within a few years, Ferrari would introduce the Dino 246 GT with its mid-mounted engine. The architecture of the supercar had shifted, and Lamborghini's young engineers, working at night without permission, had shifted it. But the story of what happened next to Lamborghini is not a story of triumph. It is a story of survival. The early 1970s found Ferruccio Lamborghini at the peak of what he had built, and simultaneously at the beginning of its unraveling. The tractor business had problems. In 1971, Lamborghini Trattori, which exported around half of its production of tractors, ran into trouble when its South African importer canceled all its orders. In Bolivia, a new military government canceled a large order of tractors that was being prepared for shipment in Genoa. The orders disappeared. The staff could not be laid off under union agreements. The costs continued, and rather than let the tractor business drag the automobile company down with it, Ferruccio made a choice that would ultimately disconnect his name from both. In 1972, Lamborghini sold his entire holding in the tractor company to rival tractor builder SAME. Soon, the entire Lamborghini group found itself in financial trouble. Development at the automaker slowed as costs were cut. Ferruccio Lamborghini began courting buyers for Automobili and Trattori, entering negotiations with Georges-Henri Rossetti, a wealthy Swiss businessman and friend. Ferruccio sold Rossetti 51% of the company for $600,000, thereby relinquishing control of the automaker he had founded. $600,000 for the company that had created the Miura, for the factory that had invented the supercar. The price was small because the situation was dire, and because what happened next was already approaching on the horizon. In October 1973, Arab OPEC members announced an oil embargo targeting the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Within weeks, fuel prices had risen sharply across the Western world. Governments imposed speed limits. Television advertisements for high-performance cars became uncomfortable viewing in countries where lines were forming at petrol stations. The 1973 oil crisis plagued the sales of high-performance cars from manufacturers around the world. The rising price of oil caused governments to mandate new fuel economy laws, and consumers to seek smaller, more practical modes of transportation. Sales of Lamborghini's exotic sports cars, propelled by high-powered engines with high fuel consumption, suffered. The market for a car that burned fuel at the rate of a Miura V12 essentially vanished. The political unrest in late 70s Italy was also a contributing factor. With the domestic market collapsing as well-heeled customers chose less ostentatious cars after a number of high-profile kidnappings and assassinations. The wealthy no longer wanted to announce themselves. In 1974, Ferruccio Lamborghini sold his remaining 49% stake in the automobile company he had built out of anger at a conversation in Maranello. He retired to a vineyard on the shores of Lake Trasimeno in Umbria. He grew wine. He built a golf course. He never returned to the automobile industry. The company he left behind did not immediately collapse. It continued building cars, including the Countach, a new design by Marcello Gandini that was even more extreme than the Miura, and which would become the poster car of an entire generation. But it staggered through the 1970s under owners who were competent businessmen and occasionally incompetent managers of an automobile company, attempting ventures that went wrong in ways that are almost painful to read about decades later. Lamborghini even asked BMW for a loan, which is rarely a good sign. The company that had humiliated Ferrari was asking for a loan. The company went bankrupt in 1978 and was placed in the receivership of brothers Jean-Claude and Patrick Mimran in 1980, who purchased the company for $3 million. $3 million. The company that had coined the term supercar. The company that employed the engineers who had changed the architecture of high-performance automobiles. The company that Ferruccio had built in a farm town out of anger, sold for the cost of a small commercial building. The Mimran brothers, heirs to a sugar fortune in their mid-20s with no automotive experience, bought a bankrupt Italian sports car manufacturer out of court-supervised receivership and proceeded to do something genuinely unexpected. They fixed it. Patrick Mimran invested heavily in the company's expansion and was later credited as being the man who saved Lamborghini. Under his management, Lamborghini's model line was expanded from the Countach to include the Jalpa entry-level sports car and the LMZ02 high-performance off-road vehicle. The LMZ02, in particular, was a remarkable object. A military-inspired high-performance off-road vehicle powered by a Lamborghini V12 engine, built in the same factory as the Countach, designed for a completely different kind of customer. It was not a supercar. It was not a grand tourer. It was a truck that could outrun most sports cars from the same era. It was proof that the factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese could produce almost anything if the engineering talent was given room to work. The Mimran sold Lamborghini to Chrysler Corporation in 1987. Chrysler sold it in 1994 to a series of investment groups. And in 1998, 35 years after Ferruccio drove back from Maranello in his damaged Ferrari, Lamborghini was acquired by Volkswagen Group through its subsidiary Audi. For the first time since the company's founding, it had owners with the industrial scale, the engineering resources, and the long-term commitment to fund what a proper sports car manufacturer needed. Development budgets that matched the ambition. What Lamborghini became under Volkswagen Group is almost the opposite of what it was under Ferruccio. Ferruccio had been a self-made man who built expensive machines for wealthy individuals like himself. He had made decisions based on pride as much as profit. He had refused to go racing because he understood the financial destruction it could cause. He had been undone by a tractor order canceled in Bolivia and an oil embargo he had no way of predicting. The Lamborghini that exists today is a global brand. Its manufacturing facility now expanded across multiple buildings in Sant'Agata Bolognese, employing over 2,000 people. The Urus, a performance SUV that would have been entirely alien to Ferruccio's original vision, became Lamborghini's best-selling model by a significant margin and was credited with transforming the company's financial position in ways no sports car alone could have achieved. The V12 engine that Giotto Bizzarini designed in 1963, the racing engine that Stanzani tamed into something drivable, powered Lamborghini's flagship cars for roughly 40 years. It grew from 3.5 liters to 4 liters to 6.5 liters. It moved from the front to the rear. It was mounted longitudinally, then transversely, then longitudinally again. It was the connective thread between the 350 GT and the Aventador, between the first product of a furious tractor manufacturer and the last naturally aspirated V12 flagship of a company that now belongs to one of the largest automotive groups in the world. That engine is no longer in production. The Revuelto, Lamborghini's current flagship, pairs a modified version of the V12 with electric motors. The era of the pure internal combustion Lamborghini is, in practical terms, ending. But here is the irony that runs underneath all of it. Enzo Ferrari dismissed Ferruccio Lamborghini as a tractor maker who did not understand cars. He was right, in the narrowest sense. Ferruccio had not spent his career in automotive engineering. He had not raced. He had not designed suspension systems or aerodynamic bodies. He was an industrialist who happened to be infuriated. But what Ferruccio actually possessed, what Enzo Ferrari completely failed to recognize in that brief, insulting conversation in Maranello, was the specific industrial competence to build a factory, find talent, manage engineers, impose production standards, and create an organization capable of turning ambitious drawings into finished automobiles. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that most fails ambitious car projects. The history of the automobile is full of brilliant engineers who could not run a factory. Ferruccio Lamborghini could run a factory because he had been running factories since the late 1940s. What he didn't have was a V12. And the person who designed that V12 was available precisely because Enzo Ferrari had also insulted and dismissed the engineer who had been building Ferrari's finest engines. The founding of Lamborghini depended on two insults from the same man. Bizzarini designed the quad-cam V12 engine, which powered Lamborghini road cars for decades, starting with the 350 GT and continuing through to the Miura and Countach. The engine that defined Lamborghini for 60 years was designed by the man Ferrari fired. The man who commissioned it was the customer Ferrari dismissed, and the factory that built it sat in the same agricultural flat valley that Ferrari had apparently decided was where tractor makers belonged, not car manufacturers. Enzo Ferrari won the argument in Maranello. He lost every consequence of it. Today, the Lamborghini factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese offers guided tours. Visitors walk through the production floor where huracans and uruses take shape under bright lights, surrounded by carbon fiber and precision tooling that Ferruccio would not entirely recognize. A museum attached to the facility holds early cars, including examples of the 350 GT, the Miura, the Countach, preserved and documented by what Lamborghini now calls its Polo Storico division. The oldest surviving production Lamborghini is a metallic gray 350 GT, chassis number 2, which left the Sant'Agata factory on August 15, 1964. It was delivered to Geneva. It still exists, certified and restored, the oldest evidence of what a furious conversation between two stubborn men from Emilia-Romagna produced. Ferruccio Lamborghini himself rarely spoke publicly about the rivalry after he left the company. He had his vineyard. He had his golf course. He had built 4 separate companies from essentially nothing, and 2 of them had changed their respective industries. He died in February 1993, a month before what would have been his 77th birthday, and before the Volkswagen acquisition that would finally give the company he founded the financial stability he had never quite managed to provide himself. Enzo Ferrari died in 1988. Ferrari, the company, had been sold to Fiat years earlier because even Maranello's most celebrated manufacturer could not sustain itself indefinitely through racing glory alone. What remains is the cars. The yellow Miura in the Alps, the Countach on the bedroom wall poster, the angular profile of a 350 GT in a museum, engine running 4 overhead camshafts designed by the engineer Ferrari decided to fire. Lamborghini should not exist. The circumstances that created it were so specific. An insult here, a walk out there, a tractor company in the right place, an engineer available at precisely the right moment, that the probability of any of it happening in the way it did was vanishingly small. But the world needed someone to tell Enzo Ferrari he was wrong. Ferruccio Lamborghini was apparently the only person willing to do it. And he was a tractor maker. The military vehicle that inspired one of the most enduring off-road dynasties in history was not designed to become an icon. It was designed to solve a problem that no army had anticipated before one particular war changed everything. That vehicle is the Jeep. And its story starts not in a factory, but in the months before the United States entered a conflict it had been trying to stay out of. We'll get to that next.